My name is Lucas Anderson. In this presentation, I'm going to talk about the SAT, the ACT, what they mean to colleges and universities, and how to work with your children to prepare them sufficiently for both. So I'm looking at this from a couple of different perspectives. On the one hand, I coordinate SAT testing here at the Audi International School, which means I recruit proctors, I organize the students into testing rooms, supervise testing, send the results, etc. On the other, I have taught here in the past in our SAT and ACT boot camp, which we do in the summer, and I'll be talking more about that. I am a private tutor, and I work with students individually. And then finally, I'm a father. I worked with my own son when he was preparing for the SAT and ACT and helped him to do well on both. Today, I'm going to try to answer the following questions. How do universities use test scores at admissions? How does test scoring work? Which test is best for my child? What is the optimal preparation schedule? And I'll tell you why optimal is should be in quotes. Should I consider tutoring? And if so, what should I look for? And what else can I do to help my child perform at their best? So first, factors in admissions. By far, the most important factor in university admissions is grade point average. More specifically, grade point average in 11th grade. All the grades matter, but 11th grade is what colleges scrutinize most carefully because it most reflects what students will do at the university level. And it is the final year for which all grades will be available. Obviously, when students apply their senior year, they will not be able to submit grades for that application. Secondly, they're going to be looking at standardized tests. Now, when I say standardized tests, I really mean the SAT and the ACT, and typically universities put that second in terms of their prioritization. Then application materials such as essays, letters of recommendation, and finally extracurriculars, what students do on the side. Now, there is some give and take in this. Not all universities are going to look at it the same way. And for certain students who, say, distinguish themselves in fencing or who are a Division I athlete, they may look at extracurriculars before they look at grade point average, just as they would if a student had won, a regional or national science fair, for example. Universities look at GPA first and foremost because it is the strongest predictor of how students are going to do in college. Universities care about that for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, they care about it because if students do well at the university level, and if they graduate in 4 years, that makes the university look better. If they graduate in 6 years, that still makes the university look okay, depending on the university. To explain that, when states and endowments are looking at giving money to universities, they're really looking at a portfolio of different metrics, including how many students graduate from that school and what percentage of students successfully graduate within 4 years or 6 years. And the higher that percentage is, the better it looks for the school. And to attract students who are more likely to graduate in 4 years, universities prioritize grade point average because it is a strong predictor of a student's ability to get good grades at a university level. And if GPA is so important, why do we need test scores? In 2 words, grade inflation. If you look at grades, if you look at the top scorers on the SAT and the ACT going back, say, 20, 30 years ago, and you look at those students now, what you'll find is that students now are earning higher grades than they did 20 or 30 years ago. This is a phenomenon that's gone on nationwide. Private schools are no exception. In general, this effect is strongest in affluent suburban public schools and in private schools. The makers of the SAT and the ACT know about this phenomenon, and the SAT and ACT allows them to compare apples to apples. It allows them to control for different school districts and their different grading policies. Also, universities like to admit students with high SAT and ACT scores because it makes them look better. I talked about that with grade point average. I'm going to talk about it again with standardized test scores. In essence, we could say, ask not what the universities could do for you, ask what you could do for the universities. Because students often think that they're being admitted to a university as a reward for all their hard work. It's really not because of that. It's really because of their potential to make that university look good later on. Another way they could do that, like I said, is through standardized test scores. The higher their test scores, the more reputable that university looks in the eyes of the general public, and particularly to ranking systems like U.S. News and World Report. The higher your average SAT score or ACT score, in general, that is a strong factor moving you up those rankings. So schools have a vested interest in admitting students with high standardized test scores, and this is particularly true in public universities. Is testing fair? Well, in general, test results follow a bell curve distribution. There is a mean for each test. The ACT, the mean is about 20. The SAT, the mean is about 1,000, 500 on each section. And there is a distribution of students who score above and below that. And we could correlate a percentile to those. So in a sense, you could look at it and say, well, if the grades are distributed according to a bell curve and it's standardized testing, then it should be fair. And we can take a raw score, in this case on the SAT, and we can convert it to a scaled score. So you'll see, for example, if you look at math in the far right column, if you get every single question right on the math sections, and there are 58 questions total, you get a perfect score. If you miss one, you lose 10 points. If you miss two on this particular test, you missed 30 points. Now on other tests, missing two might only cost you 10 points, or it might cost you 20 points, because the raw score is mapped to a bell curve distribution via a process called scaling. We'll get into more of that in a bit and talk about what that means for particular students, but essentially what we know is that you have to perform really well to get a high score. It's pretty easy to get an average score. We notice, for example, that at some points in the scaling, you could miss a question and it doesn't cost you any points, whereas other times you miss a question and it could cost you 20 or 30 points. So I mentioned percentiles. Here's how that works. There's a bell curve distribution that we looked at, and there are very few people at the extremes of either the ACT or the SAT. So for the SAT, for example, the minimum score is 400. The maximum score is 1,600. There are very, very few people that score 400. There are very, very few people who score 1,600. And everybody gets scrunched toward the middle. As a result, what that means is the majority of people score between, say, 800 and 1,200. And if you score above 1,200, it rockets you up the percentile very quickly. You'll see, for example, at the very top end, you could score a 1470, which is 130 points below the maximum, and still be in the 98th percentile. And perhaps I should explain briefly what that means, 98th percentile. Imagine there's a room full of 100 people, and we ranked them in order of lowest SAT score to greatest SAT score. If you scored in the 98th percentile, there would be 2 people in that room who scored higher than you, and there would be 97 people in that room who scored lower than you. Obviously, a higher percentile is quite good. That said, at a school like Audi, our average SAT score is 1410, which, as you can see, is the 95th percentile of nationwide test takers. And because we can map the SAT and the ACT to a percentile, we can create something called a concordance. And a concordance means that if you score this on the SAT, we can map it to an equivalent score on the ACT and vice versa. So we could look and see how you scored on the SAT, how you scored on the ACT, and in theory, they should match pretty closely. We're going to get into in practice here in a moment, but in theory, they should match pretty closely. Now, we've talked about how testing is fair. Well, how is it less fair? First of all, the SAT, through their own internal data gathering, has revealed the fact that there is a race gap in SAT score, and the same gap exists for the ACT. There is also a gap for household income. In fact, the College Board, the producers of the SAT, have determined that the strongest factor determining a student's success on the SAT is household income. When we control for all other factors, household income is the strongest factor. Now, there are a number of reasons for that, and I could spend, frankly, an entire other presentation talking about those socioeconomic factors which favor some students in standardized test taking and in education in general and in college admissions. But I think we can understand that the higher the educational attainment and the higher the household income, the better students are able to prepare for the SAT and the ACT, and the better students are able to be supported by their parents in that preparation. Because of this, a number of colleges and universities have become test optional. And this trend is growing a bit, but it hasn't yet had its watershed moment. So let me explain this a bit. For test optional colleges, they say, we don't want you to send us our test scores, and that there are a couple of universities that are like that. There probably 5% of all the universities in the United States are like that, where they say, we don't want you to send us our test scores. There are another probably 10% that say, you can send us your test scores if you want, but you don't have to, in which case, if you get good scores, you want to send them, and if you don't, you shouldn't. And then, by and large, the vast majority of schools, probably 85%, require the SAT and or ACT for university admission consideration. If you have a list of 10 colleges and universities that your child's going to apply to, almost certainly some of them are going to require the SAT or ACT, and therefore your children are probably going to take it. There is a lawsuit pending in California right now which says that because the standardized tests have been shown to favor people of certain races and certain household incomes, they should be thrown out as a factor in the admissions decisions for the University of California system of universities. If that lawsuit goes through, and if it works, and if University of California becomes test optional or changes their admissions procedures dramatically, I don't necessarily expect that, but if it were to happen, it would influence the remainder of the United States, but that's not going to happen in all likelihood before your children are taking these tests and applying to universities. So chances are your children will probably take one of the tests. I said one of the tests. The question is, which test is best for my child? There's the SAT, there's the ACT. They are interchangeable in the views of colleges and universities. You can take either, send either score, and it's fine. If you're thinking of your childhood, when you needed to take one test to apply to a certain university, know that that is no longer the practice. Colleges and universities universally accept the SAT and universally accept the ACT. There is no favoritism geographically or Ivy League versus non-Ivy League. That separation doesn't exist any longer. So you can take either test. Well, which one do you take? You want to find out which is better, and you want to take that one. Now, when you're first figuring out which test is better, you can look at the differences between the two tests. Let's start with the writing and language section on the SAT and compare it to the English section on the ACT. You'll see there are differences in the number of questions and in the timing. In general, the timing is a bit tighter on the ACT than the SAT. But for this particular section, it's mostly because the ACT includes questions in a sentence, whereas the SAT includes questions in a paragraph. So there's a bit more reading that goes into answering each question on the SAT, I should say, than the ACT. The reading section is quite different. You'll see that the reading section on the SAT is almost twice as long. There are more questions, there are more passages. The passages are a bit longer. However, the timing, you essentially have about 13 minutes per passage, and then about 45 seconds or so per question on the SAT, whereas on the ACT, you have about the same amount of time per question because you have fewer questions and fewer passages, but the timing can be a bit tighter. And so when we're trying to figure out which is better here, we want to really think about reading rate. In general, the average adult has a reading rate of about 250 words per minute. See, when we read, most of us at least, have an internal narrator. We're pronouncing the words in our brain, and that moderates the speed at which we can read. In fact, if you were to read and hold your finger on your vocal cords, you might feel them vibrate slightly because when we have an internal narrator, we subvocalize the words. Obviously, it's possible to read faster than that, typically by skipping words here and there, skipping articles, skipping prepositions, etc. And so people who read a lot tend to be a lot faster at it. And if you want to get faster at reading, your first step is to kill that internal narrator. It is possible to read 550, 650 words a minute, and the faster you read, the easier it's going to be to take standardized tests, and honestly, the easier it's going to be to complete coursework in college and probably digest information in a professional career later. Math is quite different between the two sections, or between the two tests. In the ACT, you have one section, 60 questions, 60 minutes, one question per minute essentially, whereas in the SAT you have two sections. One section is math without calculator, one section is math with a calculator. On the SAT, you also have a few questions per section that are student-produced answers, in which they are not multiple choice, in which you have to calculate the answer, grid it in, and then bubble it in. The ACT doesn't have that. The SAT, when it has multiple choice, has 4 options per question, whereas the ACT has 5. Slight differences, but they could factor in if you're guessing. The ACT covers a little bit more material than the SAT in terms of its breadth. In fact, the math section on the ACT tends to be a little bit harder and a little bit harder to prepare for because you have to learn more concepts than the SAT. In addition, on the SAT, they give you instructions for the math section. They give you formulae. They give you the number of degrees in a circle. They also give you some information about radians and angles of special right triangles and how to calculate the volume of a right cylinder. The ACT math section just dumps you in and says, here you go for it. So if you have all of those formulae memorized, you're going to distinguish yourself a little bit better on the ACT, because people who don't have those formulae memorized are not going to get those questions right unless they get lucky guessing. By and large, the biggest difference between the two tests is the existence of the science reasoning section. On the SAT, they like to tell you, oh, we have science reasoning because in our reading section and in our writing and language section, we include science-y passages that have tables of data and graphs to interpret. That's true, but it's not nearly the depth of science reasoning that you get on the ACT. What you might be noticing is that sometimes students who are strong math and science students distinguish themselves more on the ACT. That said, it's not always true. Just because a student is really good at science and math, they could have timing issues on the actual ACT, and therefore the additional time afforded on the SAT might favor them. So we can look on paper and we can say, well, I'm leaning one way or I'm leaning another way. But the next step we should all take is we should download, print an SAT practice test, an ACT practice test. These are freely available online. You can find probably 10 plus of each test. These are official, released by both testing organizations. You can download the answers, you can download the scaling information, and your children can take a practice test, simulated testing conditions, typically administered by a parent. They can do all the breaks that they would normally take. They can do all the timing they normally take. And then you can score them and see how they did. And then a week later, you can take the other test, score them and see how they did. So you get a number that tells you the result on each test. And then you can see how that maps to a percentile. And you can see in which test your student distinguished themselves. Because remember, we have a concordance. So if you look at this concordance and you say, well, my student scored a 1310 on the SAT and a 30 on the ACT, then obviously they performed better on the ACT than they did on the SAT. Or if they score 1470 on the SAT, but they score a 29 on the ACT, then obviously they did better on the SAT. And you can just look at a simple graph like this, plot the ACT score, plot the SAT score, and see where it falls. If it falls in that gray area, well, which one did you prefer taking? Which one felt better? Which one did you feel more comfortable taking? And I'll tell you about some other factors later on which might tip the scales one way or the other. But in general, follow the data. What about the SAT subject tests? First of all, there are no ACT subject tests. There are SAT subject tests which measure a student's knowledge in certain subjects. Now, I should highlight that word knowledge. The SAT test and the ACT test call themselves reasoning tests. You can figure out the answer if you know how to approach the problem. It's not just tell me the definition of a certain word. Whereas on the SAT subject test, it is about content knowledge. It is all about recall and sometimes reasoning, where you have to work out the answers to questions. Now, sometimes universities are going to require that students take the SAT subject tests. A notable example would be Georgetown. If you're applying to Georgetown, you have to have 2 or 3 SAT subject test scores to include with your application. But that represents maybe 20 universities in the country. It's a small minority. There are a number of schools that, while they don't require the SAT subject test to apply, they may require the SAT subject test scores to apply to specific programs. So if you're applying to the University of Texas, you don't need SAT subject test scores. But if you're applying to the engineering program at the University of Texas, they might want to see your physics score and your Math 2 score to see if you are prepared for the freshman level classes that they offer in their engineering program. Sometimes SAT subject test scores can be used to award college credit. However, for the most part, this is a moot point because either A, they award the same credit for an IB test score, or B, they don't offer any college credit for anything because they're a private university and they want to teach things their way / make more money. Let's talk a little bit about the quote-unquote optimal preparation schedule. I've been working with students for a number of years now, and based on my experience, this is what I've come up with. First of all, I have to give you the caveat that this differs for each student. Advice should always be personalized and tailored to the person taking the test, and every student is different. If a student is a high achiever, like they got over a 1400 on their PSAT their sophomore year and or junior year, they could aim, their sophomore year, I should say, they could aim to take the SAT as early as the fall of their junior year. Most students are going to take the SAT or ACT in the spring of their junior year. Some students are going to aim for August or September of their senior year, or maybe even October. That does happen, though typically I don't recommend it. I'll explain why later. Typically, well, there's no typical. Students can spend 2 weeks to 52 weeks preparing for the SAT and or ACT. Most students should set aside 1 to 2 hours a week for about 6 months, and that's going to give optimal results. High achievers might benefit from short, targeted, very specific intervention over a short time period in the lead up to a test, and then they take the test and they do well. These are students that are scoring, 1540 on a practice SAT or 35 on the ACT, and they've just got a little bit, they've got a few types of questions that tend to give them trouble. Or they might benefit from really intensive instruction. They might benefit from a 1-week SAT camp, if you will, and then they take the test and they're fine. Some students are going to need more instruction over a longer period of time. These are students who need to learn the concepts underlying the SAT and the ACT as opposed to the application of the concepts in the actual tests. So if a student takes a practice test in their sophomore year and they score, say, 1100, and the goal for the university on the SAT and the goals for the university that they want to attend are more like 1400, that's going to require much more preparation than typical. But most students are going to fall somewhere in the middle of these two extremes. So let me talk to you a little bit about what that schedule looks like. So this is the SAT schedule that I've come up with, which I think typically works for most students. There are caveats, of course, that this isn't right for everybody, but this is kind of the template that I tend to follow in my work with students. And a student can do this on their own, preferably with support from their parent, and do just fine. So week 1, what's the format of the test? In the books that I'm going to recommend later, the first couple hundred pages just tell you about the concepts. They tell you about, concision or logical comparisons or cosine rules or angle measurements in circles. And students should pay attention to those carefully. Oftentimes students skip those, and I think it's to their own detriment. And they can also find out information about how the tests are scored. Week 2, this is for the SAT. Take the first practice test, or begin taking the first practice test, which is in the new edition, test number 10. You can also find test number 10 online if you would like. Ignore the timing. Each question, students should spend infinite time trying to figure out the answer. And they can use almost any resources they want except the answers. They can go to Khan Academy and review a concept. They can check their math textbook. They can review rules. They can use a calculator that they find online. Anything that they could possibly think of which would help them understand how to get to the correct answer, they can use. Because for the first few tests, we're just focusing on the underlying concepts, the underlying pattern. Afterward, we're going to talk about application of that pattern. So do about the first half of the practice test. The next week, do the other half. Don't do the essay. We'll do some essays here and there, but we're not going to do them all because Audie trains students pretty well for how to write the essay. When you go over the test, look over the answers, what you got right and wrong, and look over the explanations. If you print them online, they won't have the explanations. But if you buy the book, it will have an explanation for each question. Review that. Figure out why you missed what you missed. Track those questions that you missed and understand what kind of question it was. And see, wow, I missed 3 questions about managing independent versus dependent clauses. Well, guess what you need to review? And continue this habit each time you do a test. What you're going to see is iterative, step-by-step improvement across each test if you're very intentional about going over your answers and going over the concepts that you missed. Week 4, do another practice test. Again, unlimited time. Week 5, finish that test. Week 6, start another practice test. If you're able to, start doing them on Saturday mornings because that's when you're going to take the actual test. It's a good work habit to develop. Take a week off every now and then. Maybe you have a vacation planned. Maybe you've got a lot of other tests coming up in class. Try to arrange it so that every now and then you give yourself permission to take a week off. Another practice test, in this case, test number 7 in the book. We're going down in order. This time, for the 4th practice test, read the essay prompt, annotate the text, and put an outline of how you would answer the prompt. What would each body paragraph be? What would you focus on? Which rhetorical device would you focus on in each body paragraph? If you need some inspiration on how to approach this, review what it said about the essays in the first 300 pages of the book. It talked about how the essays are scored, and it showed you examples of what good essays look like. Use them as templates. Starting with your 5th practice test, start timing the sections. Again, we're not really concerned about whether you finish in time. We're really just getting you comfortable with the idea of having the element of time and the pressure that imposes. But just track it. How are you doing on timing? After this, I've suggested a simulated SAT. About 3 months into the process, I think that students should do a simulated SAT about once a month. Saturday morning, do a full SAT with time sections, emulating test conditions, but in the comfort of your own home. And score it and look over it and just get used to how you feel about expending that much mental energy in half a day because it's a test of mental endurance. And my recommendations go on and on all the way through about 6 months. By the end of this, students will have completed 11 practice tests and they will be performing at their peak. Some students will peak earlier than this. They'll peak at practice test 6. Some students will need a few more practice tests because they're really trying to get a perfect score in a math section or something like that. They might need a bit more practice, but in general, most students are prepared and ready somewhere around 8 to 10 practice tests, and I've got 11 just to be safe. And what you don't want to do is you don't want that to manifest during the actual test that you take. You don't really want to take the test 4 or 5 times, the actual real test. You want to do enough practice tests so that you walk in and get a good score right off the bat. Maybe not your best score, but a good score so that you take the SAT once, maybe twice. And there are a number of reasons for doing this. A, for your mental sanity. B, for your budget because you have to pay every time. But C, and this impacts some students, there are a number of universities, particularly the prestigious Ivy League universities, who want your entire testing record. And it looks better to them if you walked into the SAT and took it once and scored a 1530 than if you took it 4 times and on the 3rd test you got a 1550. So they would prefer a one and done testing record, and honestly, that's the ideal. Okay, first thing you should purchase, and probably the only thing you should purchase, in terms of materials is the official book. Get the official SAT study book or the official ACT study book, or both. They're like $20 on Amazon, and you can work on them in the comfort of your own home. You can use Khan Academy, and if you like, preparing digitally or learning concepts digitally, that's fine. You are going to be taking a paper-based test, so I would advise that you use a paper-based practice method. But Khan Academy is particularly helpful for specific exercises on specific concepts. So if you go, oh, I missed that question on, the equation of a circle, and I really don't know how circles work, I keep forgetting that equation, you could go to Khan Academy, watch a module, do 10 or 12 practice problems, and you'll get it, and then you'll be able to apply it. So that can be useful. I don't mean to discount it, but you can't circumvent the need to do paper-based practice tests. Second thing you should consider is the SAT or ACT summer camp that we offer here in Audi, usually right before the beginning of the school year. It's taught by trained Audi teachers like myself who are experts in our subject and who know how to tell you about how those concepts apply on the SAT and ACT. That is free for Audi students, and signups will go out for that early in the spring, and I would encourage you, if you're in town, to register your children for that camp. Should you consider hiring a tutor? Well, if your child is wanting to apply to a highly competitive university, if the student needs more structure, if they need more support than you're able to provide for that test preparation, then a tutor can be quite helpful. Or if you just want the tutor to be the bad guy, pushing your student to do better, they can take on that role. If you've tried other things and they just haven't worked, they just haven't given you the results that you want. And if you're working within a short time frame, either because a student procrastinated or just arrived in the country, etc., or you're getting toward the end of the testing window and you need that student to perform optimally on the next test, you could consider a tutor in that situation. If you're hiring a tutor, here's what you tend to look at. You tend to look at the price. So this is the Princeton Review, and on their page, they've got all these numbers about what their programs cost. And this is partly the wrong thing to look at. What you should be looking at is what that asterisk means after the word guaranteed. It's one thing you should look at. Another thing you should look at is what they charge for private tutoring, in this case, $150 an hour. Starting at $150 an hour. Yes, SAT and ACT tutoring can be expensive. You might consider a local company. Here's a local company that operates in Houston and Katy and in Austin, and they have prices included on their websites where you can buy these packages. They don't say anything about score results like the Princeton Review says, but you can buy a number of hours at a time, and the more hours that you buy, the more the rate goes down. But these are actually the wrong things to look at. What you should be looking at is what they require in their tutors and what they pay those tutors. If you look, the hiring guidelines for Princeton Review and Cram Crew are both pretty light. A college student who is studying part-time and working part-time could be a tutor for Princeton Review or Cram Crew. And they might be really good at math. I don't mean to discount that. They might be in the engineering program, they'd be really good in math, but that doesn't mean they're a good teacher. The problem with these kinds of organizations is they pay $20, $25 an hour. And you'll notice they charged, $150 an hour or $100 an hour roughly, and they're paying $20, $25 an hour. They're not attracting the very best tutors at those rates. So it's usually better, when you can, to cut out the middleman and consider hiring a tutor privately. Now, to do that, you're going to have to gather some information because most private tutors just operate via word-of-mouth advertising, so talk to other parents. The costs are highly variable. Locally, they could be $25 an hour for that college student who's really good at what they do. It could be, in Manhattan, there are tutors that charge $2,000 an hour for SAT or ACT preparation, and yes, that is ridiculous. Locally, it's not nearly that much, but you will see $100, $150 an hour for really good tutors. In general, the price is a reflection of quality. Not always. Talk to parents and see what they tell you there. Because you're going privately instead of going through a company, you're not going to be able to pay by credit card, although most tutors work with other payment methods. Typically, if you work with a group like Cram Crew or Princeton Review or others, they may offer a place where the student can come for classes, and you may need to drive them there, and they may need to drive themselves there, or they may offer in-home tutoring and charge you a little more for that. Private tutors almost exclusively work in your home, so they drive to your home, typically for 2-hour sessions. 2-hour sessions are better for SAT preparation or ACT preparation. You just have a longer amount of time to work on an entire section or to go over a whole test, and it helps justify that travel time that the tutor has to and from your house. What else can you do? Well, we've talked about the ideal preparation schedule. We've talked about the possibility of hiring a tutor or paying money. Here are a few other things that you can do at home that are going to set your students up for success. I want you to remember 2 key words that I want most of this to revolve around: calm and confident. Your child will do best when they go into the test calm, meaning not nervous, and confident, not arrogant, not cocky, but prepared. So that's what we're trying to foster: calm and confident. How do we do that? First, in the reading section of the SAT, which is the hardest to prepare for, and on the ACT, you are tasked with reading some passages from a wide variety of materials and answering questions about those passages. Some of these passages look similar to what students might read in class. Some of them intentionally look very, very different. So, first recommendation: get a reading list. You can find reading lists online if you look. I've recommended some publications here, and they're wide-ranging. There's a ton of options, but essentially you should consider reputable news organizations who cover a variety of different topics. Pick an article or 2 that your family as a whole reads. Discuss it around the dinner table. Have conversations around it. That way, when you are reading, or when your child is reading later on, they're not just passively absorbing all the information, they're actively reading. They're asking themselves, what's the author trying to do here? And how do I know that? And then when you do have those conversations at the dinner table, you're going to be reinforcing that this is important. And you can tailor those conversations. If your child is interested in business, or they're interested in engineering, or that's one of your strengths, you can pick a publication that's accessible to a high school student that focuses on that concentration. And it could also be a jumping off point for discussions about studies in college, or, the future, or just the world around us. I would highly recommend that you take advantage of that opportunity. I say dinner table conversation. I think that's easy enough to implement, but each family will find what's right for them. Second, in my work with students as a private tutor and as an educator, I have observed, and in my reading and research, I've observed that there are a couple of factors that tend to be universally important for all students in terms of being successful in high school and beyond. First, students should be able to enjoy and integrate into their lives social activity, leisure, rest, schoolwork, but they should distinguish all of those things. They should live in separate places. There should be a time for socializing, and there should be a time for schoolwork. There should be a time for leisure. There should be a time for rest. And students need to be very intentional about using that time. So I'm providing 3 tips on how to do that. First, there are studies, my favorite is called Brain Drain, which says the mere presence of a cell phone reduces our cognitive capacity. We repeat that. The mere presence, in other words, even seeing our cell phone or even knowing it's in our pocket or purse, reduces our cognitive capacity. And there are researchers that have tested this by having university students leave their phone in another room, and they've done better on tests. So when students are doing schoolwork, I would recommend leaving the cell phone elsewhere. I recommend that, and I know it's hard. And parents, I'm going to ask you to model that when you're having those dinner table conversations, don't have your cell phone. And it's hard for everybody, but it's important. Second thing, we have this myth that we can multitask. First of all, the word multitask is a misnomer. Multitasking doesn't actually exist. What does exist is continuous partial attention. We're kind of paying attention to the road. We're kind of looking at our cell phone. We're kind of listening to music. We're kind of doing our homework. But in every case, it detracts from the other. We cannot effectively look at our cell phone and drive. We can get by with it, but it's not optimal. We can get by with listening to music while we're doing our homework, but it's not optimal. So what I would suggest is that we differentiate those things. We say, okay, now I'm working on schoolwork. Now I'm enjoying some music. We don't have YouTube videos open while we're doing homework. We don't have gaming streams open while we're doing homework. We don't have chat messaging apps open on our phone or on our computer while we're doing homework, unless we're collaborating in group work. That's a little bit different. But otherwise, stick to one thing at a time and focus intently on that one thing. And finally, differentiate spaces. Students should never, ever, ever do homework in bed. And if they could get by with it, they should never use their phone in bed. We should have spaces for different things. The desk is for homework. That comfortable chair is for our gaming or our phone usage. And the bed is for sleeping. End of story. If that doesn't work, we could consider other work environments. We could have a desk in the room. We could use the dining room table. Or we could use a cafe nearby. You know what? Just as adults work best in different spaces, so do high school students. And the key is figuring that out and applying it. Sometimes what the student thinks is best is not actually best. The bed is not actually best. For some students, the desk in the bedroom is best. But for some students, they need the accountability of having their bedroom door open or working in a semi-public space like the dining room table to keep them accountable to stay on task. Some students function best when there's some ambient noise in the background. Some students focus best when they're listening to classical music or other instrumental music. Lyrics, I don't think, work as well. Some students work best with absolute silence, and we should respect that and try to foster it as best we can. Obviously, children might have younger siblings, and those younger siblings might really love their older siblings and want to share things with them and interrupt them and talk to them. That's going to happen, and it's a valuable part of a family experience, but we should also respect students when they're trying to do homework or when they're trying to do test preparation, trying to work on an important project, trying to study, by fostering those conditions which are going to set them up for success. Some students don't need structure in terms of time management, some do. There are lots of time management methods out there. You might use them in the office for productivity or for meeting protocols. They exist also for study and learning. One that you can read a lot about is called the Pomodoro method. Pomodoro just means tomato in Italian because you use a tomato-shaped kitchen timer to count off 25 minutes, and you work for 25 minutes without interruption on one task. And if you finish it early, you keep working on it, you study and review it, and then when the 25 minutes are up, you transition to another subject. There are lots of other time management methods, and there are people who are really good at coaching others in how to implement these. But find a method that works for you and your kids. Second, in office ergonomics, we talk about the 20-20-20 rule, which says every 20 minutes, stare at least 20 feet into the distance for at least 20 seconds. And the goal here is to reduce eye strain by changing the focal length, thereby relaxing your eye muscles. I think it's important every 20-25 minutes to take a little mental break, to get up, to walk around, to refocus our attention. 2-3 minutes, grab a drink of water, sit back down, get back to work. Okay, and every hour or two, we take a longer break. Maybe we have dinner, or maybe we take a shower, or maybe we socialize a bit, or we take the dog for a walk. Whatever it is that helps us rest and recover. I've also listed the STOP protocol. STOP, quite simply, S is stop, T is take a deep breath. I don't think we do that often enough. O is observe your body, and P is proceed. You could do this in like 30 seconds or a minute. Just stop what you're doing, You can combine it with the 20-20-20 rule. Stare off into the distance, take a deep breath, think about how am I feeling? I've got some tension in my shoulders. I'm feeling a bit tired. How am I feeling? And then acknowledge that and proceed. Okay, factors impacting scoring. There's been lots of studies about this, and I'm going to talk in depth about these. First, the test is normed. You're compared against your peers who take the test on the same date as you, and that has some implications on when you test. Test anxiety. If you go in nervous, it's going to negatively impact your performance. Sleep. Need to get enough rest. Nutrition. Need to eat well. State of mind. What's our energy level? How are we feeling about life in general? And finally, the test center that we choose. Typically, I suggest that juniors test in March, May, and August for the SAT, and that August is if need be. I don't recommend June because it falls right after finals, although June is a good time to take SAT subject tests. For the ACT, I typically recommend February, April, and July. That is typically when juniors are most prepared to take the test. However, high-achieving juniors will distinguish themselves by testing in October because you typically are testing against desperate seniors. So they're going to make you look better when you test against them rather than when you test against the other high-achieving juniors who start testing in March. So if you're ready, you can take the test in October, but I don't recommend it for most people. Maybe 1 in 10 students that I know of could be ready to test in October of their junior year. Although if more students spent time over the summer between sophomore and junior year, more students could be ready in October of their junior year, but I don't necessarily recommend it for everybody. It's just an option for the high-achieving juniors. Practice. Well, the more you practice, the less anxiety you're going to feel when you take the actual test, and the more confident and calm you're going to feel when you walk in and take that test. Obviously, it's normal to have some nerves on the day of a big test. But when you've walked in after 10 practice tests, you're going to look at a question, you're going to say, oh, it's one of these questions. Okay, I know how to approach this question. Oh, it's one of these questions. Yeah, system of equations, no problem. I can use the substitution method. I could use the elimination method. Well, looks like the substitution method is going to be quickest. Boom, got it. So you want to go in with that calm confidence and also that anticipation of what it's like to spend 5 hours concentrating pretty hard on a testing experience because you've done a bunch of practice tests leading up to it. And ideally, that sets you up to be one and done. And if you had some nerves and you didn't do as well as you think you could take a second test knowing that you've got a good baseline underneath you in that performance you had on the previous test. Sleep. This is an obvious one. And in general, teenagers, particularly at highly demanding schools like Audi, and adults don't get enough of it. The recommendation for teenagers from most sources is about 8.5 hours. Now, if I could hear you through the screen, I would probably hear you chuckling because most students don't get that. But that's the recommendation. What I would tell you is that students should aim for at least 7 hours of sleep. At least 7 hours. And it's not just the night before the test. Oftentimes we think that we can accumulate sleep debt. We can say, well, we only slept 5 hours during the week, but on the weekend we're going to sleep 11 hours and that's going to compensate. It doesn't work that way. Sleep debt cannot be eliminated. It can be mitigated, but it cannot be eliminated by sleeping longer once or twice a week. So consistent 7+ hours of sleep a night is ideal. Naps. There are 2 types of naps, in my opinion. There's a 25-minute nap and there's a 90-minute nap. 25-minute nap is when you just need to be more mentally alert because you're getting kind of tired and you need to focus because you got more work to do. If you take a 25-minute nap, you will not go into deep sleep, which means when you wake up, you will wake up a lot quicker and you will not need 15 or 20 minutes to get back into the swing of things. If you take a 20 to 25-minute nap, you'll be back to into the swing of things in about 30 seconds. A longer nap, a 90-minute nap, is useful when you feel physically tired. If you feel physically tired, I would recommend sleeping 90 minutes, which is 1 full sleep cycle. You'll typically find that after 90 minutes, you are pretty close to awake, so it's easy to wake back up. If you try to wake up in between 25 minutes and 90 minutes, it's going to be pretty hard to wake back up. Nutrition. Eating well every day is important. Eating well the day of a test is particularly important because we want students to maintain consistent blood sugar levels. We don't want peaks and troughs of blood glucose because that's going to mean peaks and troughs of energy available to the brain to do the important task of thinking our way through a long and difficult test. I'm not a doctor, but in my opinion, the best way to get stable blood sugars is by eating food groups like complex carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. Avoiding, therefore, simple carbohydrates, which are going to cause a peak and a subsequent trough in blood sugar. So the morning of a test, eggs are great, nuts are great, avocados, yogurt, whole grain wheat toast, things like that are going to be good for mental concentration, and they also make for good snacks. Bringing nuts or bringing yogurt or something like that as a snack midway through the test is a wise idea. And obviously drinking plenty of water is important, staying hydrated. State of mind. This is going to sound silly, but in the weeks leading up to the test, students are hereby forbidden from falling in love, breaking up, having a major fight with a sibling or family member, etc. We want to keep that drama to a minimum so that students can go in with a clear conscience. We don't want students going into a test with, a recent breakup or a recent infatuation or whatever it may be weighing heavily on their mind, because that's going to distract them from doing their best. So, I don't mean to tell you no arguing with your children in the week leading up to the test, but, think about their mental state and try to promote that calm confidence that we've been reiterating. Finally, the location where the student tests is going to have an impact. Familiarity with the test environment has a positive impact on students' testing. If students test in a familiar location, with a familiar proctor, with familiar test takers, and with a comfortable temperature, they're going to do better. Now, we do offer the SAT here at Audi. We do not offer the ACT. We've asked them to be a test center, and they've told us no, that we're too small of a test center to offer the ACT. So if a student is taking the SAT, I would highly, highly recommend having the student test at Audi. Even if you live in Sugar Land, even if you live in Katy, I would suggest Audi because the familiar testing location and the familiar proctor and the comfort in the classroom is going to positively impact their result. If you're taking the ACT, I would suggest taking it at a school close to home, Lamar, Memorial High School, etc., Clements, and I would suggest that you go visit that school before the test so that you know where you're testing, where you're going to park, which entrance you're going to go in, who you're going to ask if you need help, etc. You don't want to arrive at the test center on test day at 7:45 a.m. and circle the building trying to figure out where to park. That is just going to stress you out before the test, and it's not going to be productive. So familiarize yourself with the testing location before you go. Okay, those are all the factors I know of which impact a student's performance on the SAT, which I feel you could control. If you have further questions, talk to college counseling. See them to generate a list of schools that you're looking for and figure out what their median SAT score is or ACT score is, so then you know what they're looking for. Talk to them about admissions factors. Each school is a little bit different. Large public universities view standardized test scores a little differently than some private, small liberal arts schools. Talk to them about your test results. What do they mean in their implications for the schools that you're thinking of applying to? For subject tests, talk to the teachers of those subjects, whether it's chemistry or physics or math. Ask them about what they offer in terms of SAT-2 preparation. Most of them offer free before-school tutorials geared specifically toward SAT subject tests. Those typically start in August of the senior year for classes like chemistry, physics, math 2, etc. Talk to them about when your students should take that test. Should they test? Are they ready to take Math 2 in June of their junior year, or would they be better off waiting until October of their senior year? For some students, that's an individual piece of feedback, and I would suggest talking to the teachers and asking their opinions on that. If you have any questions, you can feel free to email me. My email address is landerson@audie.org. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation, and I hope you've gotten a lot out of it. Thanks very much.